Hi everyone, I'm George Hussey, Dr. 914 from Automobile Atlanta, and today we're going to do a tour of the 944 S2 engine. We are restoring this car and its engine for the son of the original owner, who ran the car maybe 200,000 miles and decided to get a complete refurbishment. So we've taken the car apart, we're restoring the interior and the suspension and the engine. The rest of the car, pretty good. Transmission, brakes, and because the car had 200,000 miles, even though these engines last a lot longer, we decided to take it down and at least put new bearings in it. Well, we took it completely down, put new bearings in it, and found out the bearings really weren't that bad as usual. But we put new bearings in it anyway, like I said. So we sort of dolled this up, as you can see, and it being out of the car is a great time to show you the different components and how they work. So we'll start at the front of the engine. The S2 engine was probably the culmination of 944 engine development. We know the 968 engine was just a little bit more sophisticated, but this engine's about as good as it gets. Double overhead cam, automatic belt tensioner, large displacement, runs beautifully, absolutely beautifully and very smoothly because of the dual balance shafts. Four-cylinder engines are notoriously full of vibration and clunky because they've got four straight pistons beating down on the crank. Well, Porsche decided they were going to make a four-cylinder engine that was very smooth. So they put in two counterbalance shafts. They almost look like camshafts that roll opposite to each other to counterbalance the pounding of the four cylinders. And what resulted was a very, very, very smooth, great running engine. The different components are the automatic belt tensioner, which came along in 1987. There was a problem when these cars were first made because they have a nice little rubber band belt to run the camshaft. Well, these Americans didn't know they needed to change the cam belt, and they drove the car and drove the car and drove the car, and about 45,000 miles later, even though the maintenance manual staring them in the face said change the belt, they didn't do it. The belt broke, all the valves bent. So they kick the car and they say, what a piece of crap, and sold it. So Porsche thought, well, we have to sort of take care of these American types. So in 1987, they added an automatic belt tensioner, which kept proper tension on the belt at all times and preserved its life. That doesn't mean that the belt doesn't need to be changed, but it saved many an engine from early destruction. This is the water pump, the latest design. The dummy fitting on here is for the turbo electric water cooler that this doesn't have. The water pumps did a metamorphosis also. There were 5 or 6 or 7 different varieties. The final one, called the turbo one with the plastic impeller, the best of the breed. Thermostat internally located inside the water pump, very, very important to keep the thermostat in there so that the engine runs at the proper temperature, and the seal is inside here. Directly connected to the heater control valve, which is right here. Besides relocating for more room in the back, these heater control valves in the earlier cars were at the back of the engine and very, very hard to get to. So they put it up front to where it was easily accessed and easily changed. This is vacuum controlled, and when the car is off and the key in your pocket, the heater control valve is on. You can see the lever here, which is pneumatically controlled. So the heater control valve is on, so if you want to bleed the cooling system, it's easy to bleed because the whole system is open. When you start the car, it pulls and closes the heater control valve. If your car is pouring heat when it's running, probably you're missing the vacuum to the heater control valve due to one of the little vacuum motors or due to a line off someplace. Water hose going back to the heater core in the back of the engine. The control unit plug, the control unit is not plugged in. We're not quite finished with this engine yet, but you can just see some of the components. Control unit goes through a bulkhead plug and is located on the passenger side in front of the passenger footwell. Exhaust manifolds. The engine mount is a rubber engine mount here. Oil pressure sending unit. Oftentimes what happens is that people put this engine back in or are working on it, and they get this lead here crimped up underneath the cover or up underneath another component, and it shorts out, and then the oil pressure needle spikes or the oil light is on all the time. So you got to really watch that and make sure it's carefully and nicely routed. The later cars have also a sending unit for oil level, which is great for those who don't want to use the dipstick, and if the oil level goes down, then the light flashes. These are a little bit finicky, so you could have proper oil level and the light still comes on, but it's better to warn you ahead of time than before time. Oil filter right here connected to the oil cooler. These oil coolers on the early cars had a problem with the sealing gaskets being inferior, so we had many of these cars bleeding oil into the cooling system, and people would say, oh my, I have blown the head gasket. But no, they didn't at all. They blew the oil cooler gaskets, which are a fairly easy repair. A little hard to get to with the engine in, obviously very easy to get to here. But the oil having more pressure than the cooling system blew the oil into the cooling system and made it milky. So we have changed many of these with a new updated oil cooler, which totally solves the problem. These are the two sensors right here. This is the fuel injection temperature sensor, which when the car is cold, signals the control unit to richen the mixture up. And then behind this, we have the temperature sending unit for the gauge. You can see it down in there. It's a little hard to get to. The early models were single lead, the late models were double lead. If you have a problem with the car running too rich, or on the other hand not starting, this could be the culprit right here. On the front of the car, we have the fuel pressure damper. This keeps the fuel flow steady as the pump pulses and beats. This straightens it out so we have nice, even, steady fuel pressure. The S2 has got a tap for a fuel pressure gauge, test gauge, here at the back of the fuel rail. The earlier ones have the tap at the front of the fuel rail. You can unscrew this, you can put a fuel pressure gauge on it and check the fuel pressure, make sure it's about 40 pounds and no more. Which brings us to the fuel pressure regulator at the back of the block before the fuel returns. Sometimes these go bad and they cause the fuel to back up, the pressure to get higher and higher and higher, and finally the car conks out. That's because this fuel pressure regulator has gone bad and the pressure builds up and conks out the engine. So if you're driving along, you come to a stop, the car conks out, doesn't start for a little while, this could be suspect. That's why it's best to check the fuel pressure periodically. 4 injectors here, 1, 2, 3, 4. The S2 injectors are different than the earlier models, plugged in by the 4 harness connectors. The air oil separator right here, this is, I would say, probably a pollution device. Replaces the old PCV valve when the engine blow-by comes in here. It lets the oil settle down and go back into the oil, and then the oil filler is right here. Oil dipstick, not connected yet. Ignition harness right here, and the hall sensor in the back, which plugs in between the engine and the transmission. Just has one for this car. The magnificent double intake and exhaust cam set with, of course, Porsche written on the top of the valve cover. Obviously, we don't have this car back together. It makes it easier to show you. So the S2 cams are driven, and the S are driven by a chain and a chain tensioner here, which runs on a slider. And this gives some pretty terrific power. Very important to set the cam timing. There's actually a tool that looks like a little cam lobe that you can stick over 2 of these at a time to make sure they're in perfect alignment. If the cams are not in perfect alignment, you either get no power at the bottom end and good power at the top end, or vice versa. So important to have them dead on the money. The problem with these is that nobody looked at this little $5 slider piece. Of course, it's a little more than that, but it's cheap. So they didn't replace it. The car ran this thing down to where there was no more slide anymore. There's just grab. So this chain then grabbed this tensioner and ripped it off of the head, knocking out both teeth on the camshafts and breaking it off the head. So now we have a broken head, a bad tensioner, and two bad camshafts. And what does that mean? Well, that usually means that the whole car is totaled. So we end up welding the head back together, buying a new tensioner, buying a new chain, repairing the cams. We can send those out and get those repaired. Putting the whole thing back together, and maybe, I don't know, $8,000 later, everything is fixed. The moral of that story is to make sure that this little tiny slider is replaced. Probably every 45,000 miles would be a good measure, but very important to at least check it every time the car is serviced. The valve cover comes off easily. It's easy to check to make sure that it is not worn out, and then you're back on your way. The central part of the fuel injection system is not here. It's the airflow meter, which senses the incoming air and adjusts the mixture accordingly, duration of injection. And the plug-in is here, and accompanying that is the throttle switch, which immediately senses throttle movement from the throttle right here and instantly adjusts the duration of injection to give you a little boost. It's almost like an accelerator pump on a carbureted car. So as soon as the throttle is hit, this goes to full, this is like an on-off switch. So as soon as the throttle is hit, this signals the control unit to up the duration of injection immediately so that you don't have any lag off idle. And finally, the Hall sensor back here, which plugs in on the front of the cam, and if this fails, you have no ignition, so that's important to check periodically to make sure. And if you have an ignition problem, unlike the earlier 944s, which have the timing and reference mark sensor on the back, the S2 has a Hall sensor at the front. This is a nice, easy thing to get to and to check. So that's the tour of the 944 S2 engine. Please look forward for our other videos in the near future. Thank you, Dr. 914. George Hussey, Automobile.